Montana Territory. October 1883. The kind of autumn that strips the cottonwoods bare before the first snow even threatens. The homestead at the end of Holt Creek Road had stood for 11 years, and in that time it had learned to lean into the wind, into the silence, into the particular weight of a woman carrying everything alone. The porch boards bowed in the middle. The woodpile beside the south wall had dwindled to a sorry stack of split pine, enough for maybe 2 weeks, no more. And the woman who lived there, Eleanor Marsh, had noticed this the same way she noticed most things she could not immediately fix. She noted it, set her jaw, and moved on. Eleanor was 41 years old that October. She had arrived in the territory as a bride of 20, full of the kind of hope that frontier pamphlets were made of, and she had buried that husband, Thomas Marsh, cattleman, quiet man, good man, for years prior, in the small cemetery at the edge of Calverton, the nearest town, 6 miles east. Their son James had left for Oregon the spring following the funeral. He wrote when he remembered to. She did not blame him. The land had taken something from all of them. What the town of Calverton knew about Eleanor Marsh could be summarized in a few sentences exchanged over dry goods and fence posts. She was the widow out on Holt Creek. She kept to herself. She hadn't sold the homestead yet despite 3 separate offers from the Dunmore Land Company, and she was, in the opinion of more than one man in town, stubborn to the point of foolishness. What the town did not know, what it had never bothered to ask, was that Eleanor Marsh had been fighting something far heavier than loneliness for 4 years. She had been fighting the slow erosion of everything she had been before grief made her into a footnote. That October morning, she was stacking what remained of the woodpile when she heard the wagon coming up the creek road. She did not turn immediately. Out here, you learned to wait and see whether sound became something worth reacting to. It did. The wagon stopped at the gate. The man on the bench set the reins down slowly, like a man who had learned that sudden movements cost you. He looked at the pile of wood. He looked at the axe leaning against the fence post, untouched. Then he looked at her. She turned then. And something shifted in the October air that neither of them had a word for yet. Stay with this story, because what happens between these two people before the first snow falls is the kind of thing this valley never forgot. His name was Cade Hollis, and Calverton had exactly one opinion of him, that he was the man who had ridden away from the Hollis homestead in the spring of 1863 without looking back, and that a man like that didn't deserve looking back at. The story, as it had calcified over 2 decades of retelling, went like this. Cade Hollis had been engaged to marry Clara Fenwick, the schoolteacher's daughter, raised proper, well-regarded throughout the county, and had left without notice 3 weeks before the wedding. No letter. No explanation given to Clara, to her father, or to the handful of families who had already baked pies for the reception. He had simply gone. And Clara Fenwick had eventually married a banker in Billings and made a fine life for herself, thank you very much, so the wound was not fresh, but the scar was still visible on the face of anyone in Calverton old enough to remember. What the town did not know, what Cade had never offered, because offering it would have required trusting people with something true, was that he had left because of a debt that was not his to pay. His father, William Hollis, had borrowed money from the wrong man. The kind of man who collected not in currency but in deference and fear. Cade had left to protect his family from the consequences of staying. He had sent money back for 3 years, then his mother had passed, his father had sold the land to Dunmore and followed her into the ground 2 winters later, and Cade had found himself with no reason to return and every reason to keep moving. He had spent 20 years moving. Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. Cattle work, fence work, the kind of labor that asks nothing of you except your back and your silence. He had come back to Montana not because Calverton called him, but because a man reaches a point where keeping moving begins to feel indistinguishable from running, and running from nothing is its own kind of prison. He had not expected to pass the Holt Creek Road. He had not expected to see a woman alone with a dwindling woodpile and an axe she clearly hadn't swung in days. He had not planned to stop. But the axe was there. The wood needed splitting. And something in the set of her shoulders, that specific kind of straight that isn't pride but is what pride looks like after years of practice, made him pull the reins anyway. Eleanor looked at him the way a woman looks at something she hasn't decided about yet. "You need help with that wood?" he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't ask, she said. No, he agreed. You didn't. He climbed down from the wagon anyway. She watched him pick up the axe, turn a log on its end, and split it clean in a single stroke. She said nothing. He said nothing. The axe came down again. In Calverton, 6 miles east, there were already enough reasons why these two people should stay strangers. The town had already written that story as towns do, quickly, confidently, and without consulting the people in it. But the wood needed splitting, and Cade Hollis had come back to a place that had no use for him, and Eleanor Marsh had been carrying the weight of that homestead alone for 4 years. And sometimes the smallest ordinary thing, a man stopping a wagon he had no reason to stop, is the thing that undoes everything. He split wood for 2 hours that first morning. When he was done, the pile reached the eaves. He set the axe back against the fence post, nodded once, and climbed back onto his wagon without asking for a thing. Eleanor watched him go. Her hands, she noticed, were not trembling. They never did. But something else, something she had no name for and would not have named aloud even if she had shifted in the way the afternoon light fell across the yard. She did not know his name yet. She did not know what Calverton thought of him. And she did not know that the next time she would see him, he would come back without the wagon and with nothing to offer except his presence and his silence and the particular steadiness of a man who has been alone long enough to know how to be still. He came back 3 days later. No wagon this time. Just the man on foot, coming up the creek road in the early morning with his coat collar turned against the cold. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window and felt something she immediately argued herself out of: relief. She was not relieved. She was merely noting the arrival of another pair of hands, which a working homestead could use. She opened the door before he reached the porch. "The fence line on the north pasture," she said. "3 posts are rotted through." He stopped, looked at her. "Good morning." She held the look for a moment. Then quietly, "Good morning." It was not an apology, exactly. But it was something. He took it as such. They worked the fence line through the morning without speaking much. He dug out the rotted posts. She handed him the new ones from the back of her mule cart, cut to length the previous evening. She had done this herself before, the cutting, the measuring, the tamping down of new posts in the cold ground, but it went faster with 2. This was the kind of mathematics that frontier life made undeniable, whatever the heart might prefer. Around midday, she poured coffee from a tin pot she'd carried out in a sack. They sat on opposite sides of the cart and drank it without ceremony. A hawk turned slow circles above the creek. The cottonwoods along the water had gone fully gold. "You're Cade Hollis?" she said. Not a question. He set his cup down. "Who told you?" "Harlan Price at the general store. He wanted to make sure I knew." A beat of silence. The hawk dropped and was gone. "And now you know," he said. "And now I know," she agreed. She looked out at the fence line, not at him. "He also wanted to make sure I knew you'd be gone before Christmas." His words. "Harlan Price has been wrong about most things since 1871, Cade said. "I don't see why he'd change the habit." That surprised her into something near a smile, just the corner of her mouth, quickly controlled. But he saw it. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said more carefully. "I came back because this is where I'm from. That's all." "This valley doesn't want you back," Eleanor said. She said it without cruelty, just as a woman states the weather. "I know that." The pause. "Does that mean you don't want me here either?" She looked at him then. Directly, the way she had not yet done. He was weathered in the way working men are weathered, not broken, just shaped by years. His eyes were the particular gray of sky before a storm. Patient eyes. The kind that had learned not to flinch. "I want the fence fixed," she said finally. "The rest, I haven't decided." It was, in its way, the most honest thing anyone in the valley had said to him since he'd returned. He picked up the post digger and went back to work. What neither of them said, what both of them felt moving underneath the ordinary labor of that morning like cold water under river ice, was that this was already something. Not romance, not yet. But the particular gravity of 2 people who have been alone long enough to recognize solitude in another person the way you recognize your own reflection. Unmistakably, uncomfortably, and with a start. He came back the next morning. And the one after that. By the end of the week, there was a pattern. He arrived at first light. They worked until mid-afternoon. He left before supper without being asked to stay, because he understood that some lines required permission before crossing. The homestead slowly showed its gratitude. The fence held, the woodpile grew, a hinge on the barn door that had screamed since spring finally went quiet. Calverton noticed. Of course it did. A town of 400 people, one general store, and 2 churches notices everything. It was Agnes Price, Harlan's wife, a woman whose opinions traveled faster than the afternoon post, who said it first, loud enough to be heard at 3 separate tables in the Calverton dining room one Tuesday in late October. Eleanor Marsh letting Cade Hollis work her land is like a woman opening her door to the very wolf that ate her neighbor's flock. She just don't know it yet. The dining room had agreed, or at least had not disagreed loudly enough to matter. What Agnes Price meant, though she would not have said it with this precision, was that the town had spent 20 years building a particular story about Cade Hollis, a man who abandoned what he promised and left others to carry the weight of his leaving. And now here he was, making himself useful on the Marsh homestead, being quiet and steady and present in all the ways the story said he was not. And that was the most threatening thing a man could do to a story, live in contradiction of it. The pressure arrived at Eleanor's door in the form of Reverend Aldous Fitch, who came out to Holt Creek Road on a Wednesday morning under the stated premise of a pastoral visit and the actual premise of delivering a message the town did not have the directness to deliver itself. He sat in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and told her, gently, that people were concerned. That a widow woman's reputation was a fragile thing. That Cade Hollis had a history that the community had not forgotten and could not be expected to forget. That perhaps it would be wise, pastoral word, wise, to find other arrangements for the seasonal work. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. She poured him coffee. She let him finish. Then she said, Reverend, has Cade Hollis done anything in this valley since he returned that you could point to and call wrong? Fitch opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Not as such. But the past is yours and the town's to carry, Reverend, she said. It's not mine. I've got a fence line that holds and a woodpile that'll last till March, and I did neither of those things alone. That's all I have to say about it. He left. He reported back. The town shook its head. They saw a widow making a mistake. They saw a lonely woman being taken advantage of by a charming drifter, except that he wasn't charming, particularly, and she wasn't the kind of woman who was taken advantage of, which created a contradiction too uncomfortable to examine closely, so they went back to shaking their heads. What was worse, what no one in Calverton could yet see, was that the conversations between Eleanor Marsh and Cade Hollis in the slow hours of working a homestead together had begun to do something to both of them. Not in the way of romance novels or frontier fantasies. In the harder way. The way 2 people who have each lost something irreplaceable begin to recognize the particular shape of the other's loss. She had told him about Thomas, not the grief, but the man. The way he'd known every horse by temperament. The way he'd always burned the first batch of biscuits and blamed the stove. He had told her almost nothing about himself, but he had listened with the kind of attention that is itself a form of honesty. And then one evening, the last week of October, the temperature dropping hard, the first whisper of winter moving down from the high peaks, she asked him to stay for supper. He said yes. They sat at the table where she had eaten alone for 4 years and talked until the fire burned low. When he stood to leave, she said, without looking up from the table, my husband used to say this valley punishes patience and rewards noise. I've spent 4 years thinking he was wrong about that. Cade put on his coat. Was he? I'm not sure anymore, she said. He left. She sat there for a long time in the low firelight, turning the thought over in her hands like a stone she'd found in the creek and couldn't quite explain. Calverton had already decided what this was. What neither of them had yet decided was what it actually might become. The letter from the Dunmore Land Company arrived on the 1st of November, and it was not the first. But this one was different in 2 ways. It was signed not by a land agent but by a lawyer in Helena, and it contained a number with more digits than any of the previous offers. It also contained a sentence, buried in the third paragraph, that Eleanor read 3 times to make sure she had not misunderstood. In the event that the property owner continues to decline, our client reserves the right to pursue alternative legal remedies regarding the outstanding water rights dispute filed in Calverton County, September 1882. She had not known about a water rights dispute filed in September 1882. She had never been notified. She had not, in the 4 years since Thomas died, had reason or resources to hire a lawyer to audit the land records. And now here it was, a lever, a threat dressed in legal language, polite as a funeral suit. She sat with the letter on the kitchen table for a long time. The stove ticked in the cold. Outside, the first real snow of the season was falling quietly over the valley, covering the fence line they had fixed together, the woodpile they had built together, the yard that had begun, just barely, to feel like it belonged to the living again. She thought about James in Oregon. She thought about Thomas in the Calverton cemetery, beneath whatever snow was falling there. She thought about the 4 years of solitude and the specific weight of being the only person who cared whether this land survived. And then she thought, enough. Not the defeated kind of enough. The other kind. The kind that arrives after years of quiet endurance and means something has shifted at the bottom of the decision. She folded the letter. She put on her coat. She walked to the barn, saddled the roan mare without rushing, and rode the 6 miles into Calverton in the dark and the snow with the particular focus of a woman who has made up her mind about something, though she had not yet made up her mind about what, exactly. She tied the horse at the post outside Harlan Price's general store, the only lamp still burning at that hour, and she was halfway to the door when she heard a voice behind her. Eleanor. She turned. Cade was standing at the edge of the porch awning, a paper sack of supplies in one hand. He had clearly just come from the store himself. He looked at her face, at the set of her jaw, at whatever was visible in her eyes, and he did not ask if she was all right, because he could plainly see she was not. What happened? He said. She told him. Standing in the snow in the dark outside Harlan Price's general store, she told him about the letter and the water rights dispute and the number with more digits than any previous offer. She told him without dramatics, the way she told most hard things, as facts that needed organizing before they could be addressed. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You were going to ride to Helena tonight? He said. It wasn't a question. I was going somewhere, she said. I hadn't decided where. That's not the same as leaving, he said carefully. Isn't it? She looked at him. There was the question underneath the question. You're the one who knows about leaving, Cade Hollis. You explain to me how it starts. He took that without flinching. No, he said. It isn't. Because you came back to yourself before you went too far. That's the difference. The snow came down between them. The mare shifted at the post. Stay with this story, because what Cade Hollis does next is the last thing Calverton would have predicted, and the only thing that could have changed what came after. He went to see Harlan Price the next morning. Not to ask a favor. Not to argue. He went because Harlan Price had been the county recorder's unofficial memory for 30 years and because Cade Hollis, whatever the town believed of him, knew something about land records and debts and the particular legal strategies of men like Dunmore's lawyers. He had learned those things the hard way. He had spent 7 years in New Mexico watching a land company do to small homesteaders what Dunmore was now attempting to do to Eleanor. He knew how the mechanism worked. He knew, specifically, that a water rights dispute filed without proper notification to the title holder was challengeable, not easily, not cheaply, but challengeable, if you could prove the notification had never been delivered. Harlan opened the store that morning to find Cade Hollis sitting on the front step. He stopped. His expression did the thing it always did when confronted with something inconvenient. It arranged itself into disapproval. I don't want trouble, Harlan said. Neither do I. Cade stood. I need to look at the county filing records from September 1882. Specifically, the Dunmore water rights dispute on the Marsh parcel. Those are public records. I know. That's why I'm asking politely instead of writing to Helena and requesting them through the court. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold and still. The snow from the previous night lay clean and untracked across the street. Why do you care about Eleanor Marsh's land? Harlan asked. Not cruelly, genuinely. As if the answer might tell him something he needed to understand. Because no one else here seems to, Cade said. That landed. Harlan knew it. He opened the store. The records showed what Cade had suspected. The notification of the water rights dispute had been filed at the county seat in Helena, posted to a general delivery address that had been Thomas Marsh's address, not Eleanor's, and had never been redelivered after Thomas's death was registered. In legal terms, it was a procedural gap large enough to drive a wagon through, if you had a lawyer willing to drive it. Cade did not tell Eleanor this immediately. He told her that evening, sitting on the porch of her homestead in the cold with the last of the sunset burning orange above the Beartooth Range to the south. He told her what he had found, what it meant, and the name of a lawyer in Helena who had beaten Dunmore's people twice before on similar filings. She listened. She asked 3 precise questions. He answered them. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at the mountains. The orange light was going to purple. "Because I left something once that I shouldn't have," he said. "I've been carrying that a long time. I figured it was time I stayed somewhere long enough to be useful." She was quiet. The cold moved across the porch between them. Cade. His name, said the way a person says a word they've been thinking for longer than they let on. "What did you leave?" He turned to look at her. He told her. Not the town's version, his. His father. The decision made in the dark when he was 23 years old and saw no other way out. The years of moving. The particular loneliness of a man who chose exile and then forgot what he was in exile from. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him the same way she had looked at the letter, with clear eyes and a mind working quietly behind them. "You should have told people," she said. "I know. It might not have changed what they thought. I know that too." Silence. The last light left the mountains. "I need to go to Helena," she said. "I'd rather not go alone." He looked at her. "When?" "Monday." "All right," he said. And that was all. But before he stood to leave, before this moment sealed itself into the ordinary business of what came next, she said it. Quietly. Looking at her hands. Not accusingly. Just honestly, the way grief and time sometimes turn a question loose from where it has been stored. "Where were you 20 years ago?" He understood what she meant. Not literally, not the geography. She meant, if the world had been different. If you had stayed. If the leaving had never happened. What would we have been to each other before we became people shaped by separate losses? He did not have an answer. He sat back down. "I don't know," he said. "I've thought about that. I've thought about a lot of things I can't change." The pause. "But I'm here now." She looked up at him. Her eyes, not soft, not hard. Something more honest than either. The look of a woman deciding something she will not take back. "Yes," she said. "You are." They rode to Helena on Monday. They came back on Thursday. They came back with a signed brief from the attorney, a methodical man named Prescott who took the case on a contingency arrangement, and with a counterfiling that challenged the procedural validity of Dunmore's water rights claim on 3 separate grounds. Eleanor told no one in Calverton what had happened or what was coming. She did not need their approval. She did not, at this point, particularly need their understanding. But the town found out anyway. Towns always do, and the reaction was not what anyone might have scripted. Because Harlan Price, who had given Cade access to those county records, was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had been wrong, and he had been wrong in a way that was now difficult to ignore. He had spent 20 years telling a story about Cade Hollis that had been missing its most important chapter. And Harlan Price, whatever his faults, did not enjoy being wrong in public twice. He told Agnes. Agnes told Reverend Fitch. Fitch, to his credit, came back out to Holt Creek Road, not on behalf of the town this time, but on his own, and he sat in Eleanor's kitchen again and said, simply, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Marsh. And I expect I owe Cade Hollis one as well." "I'll let him know," Eleanor said. She poured him coffee. The Dunmore Land Company's challenge was dismissed by the Helena District Court the following February on procedural grounds. The water rights dispute was nullified. The homestead on Holt Creek Road remained Eleanor Marsh's by every legal measure the territory had. The town of Calverton did not throw a celebration. That was not how small towns acknowledged being wrong, not with declarations, but with the slow adjustment of small behaviors. Men who had previously walked past Cade Hollis in the street began to nod. Agnes Price, in what was, for her, a considerable gesture, remarked publicly that the fence work on the Marsh property was as fine as anything in the county. Harlan offered Cade a line of credit at the general store, which was its own kind of apology in the language of the frontier West. And Cade Hollis, who had come back to Montana without knowing why and had found himself, improbably, unexpectedly, with the stubbornness of a man who has been running long enough to recognize solid ground when he stands on it, began to stay. He did not move onto the homestead. He rented a room above the smithy in Calverton. He continued to come up the creek road in the mornings. The pattern had changed now, less about the work that needed doing and more about the conversation that had begun and shown no sign of completing itself. They argued about things. She was sharper than him and knew it. He was steadier than her and she knew it. The winter passed in this way, which is to say it passed less like a season of deprivation and more like the particular quiet of two people learning the shape of each other without being in a hurry about it. It was not a fairy tale. It was two people in their 40s, each worn and specific and not easily given to sentiment, finding that the life they had each assumed was finished was, in fact, merely waiting, the way a creek goes underground in dry country and comes back to the surface, cold and clear, where you least expect it. The town watched. The town, in the end, let them be. By the time spring came back to the valley, real spring, the green and mud kind that followed Montana winters like a promise finally kept, something had settled between Eleanor Marsh and Cade Hollis that neither of them felt the need to announce. They announced it anyway. On the first Sunday of April, they arrived at the Calverton church together, which in the social grammar of that time and place was not a small thing. They sat in the third pew. They did not hold hands. They did not make declarations. But they arrived together, and they left together, and the valley understood what that meant. The homestead on Holt Creek Road did not transform overnight into something from a storybook. It remained what it had always been, a working piece of land at the edge of a long valley in the Montana Territory, with a porch that bowed in the middle and a woodpile that needed tending and a fence line that required attention every spring when the frost came out of the ground. What changed was the quality of the silence inside it. The silence of a house with only one person in it is a specific kind, full, pressurized, like air before a storm. The silence of a house with two people who have chosen each other is something altogether different. It is the silence of things that don't need to be said. Eleanor's son James came back from Oregon that June to see for himself what his mother's letters had not quite told him. He found a woman he recognized and one he did not, the same straight spine, the same unsparing clarity of mind, but lighter somehow, as if something she had been braced against for years had finally moved. He shook Cade's hand on the porch of the homestead and said, in the direct way of young men who have been away long enough to have opinions, "She doesn't need anyone to take care of her." "I know," Cade said. "That's not why I stayed." James looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and went inside to see his mother, and that was that. What Cade Hollis had come back to Montana for, without knowing it, without having a name for it, was not redemption in the public sense. He had not needed the town to forgive him. He had needed to stop moving long enough to find out if there was still something worth building. And the answer had come not in any grand declaration but in the slow, ordinary accumulation of mornings on a working homestead, in the particular company of a woman who asked clear questions and said difficult things plainly and had, on a November night in the snow outside a general store, turned back from leaving when she did not have to. "Where were you 20 years ago?" she had asked. It was the question of a woman who had been alone long enough to know that some things cannot be recovered, only replaced, in the best way, by something different and true and present. He had not been there 20 years ago. He had not been able to be. And no answer he could give would change the 20 years they had each spent building who they were in the other's absence. But he was here now. And so was she. And on the good days, which became, over time, most of the days, that was enough. This valley remembered a lot of things. It remembered the families that had come and failed and gone. It remembered the long winters and the short summers and the particular color of October light on the Beartooth Range. And as local memory tells it, it remembered Eleanor Marsh and Cade Hollis. Not as a fairy tale, not as a scandal, but as a study in what happens when two stubborn, worn, honest people refuse to let the story the world tells about them be the only story there is.